everyone, welcome to our last week in Kin 335. We're going to be going over 11 years of sport this week, so we're going to be going over things that happened from 2015 to now, 2026. If you read or if you have the third edition, you're able to read about some of these things in chapter 10, but for those of us who don't, I just assigned some of the Edson chapters to kind of prelude a lot of the experiences, values that exist during these 11 years, talking about commercialization, globalization, and how new media is really shaping this new world of sport. And so as I do, I like to first introduce you to general timeline things. I should say 2026 because I did include stuff from this year that's already happened. Obviously, there's a lot that goes on during these 11 years, but some of the things that I want to focus on are the things that are highlighted. So Donald Trump elected president the first time in 2016, leading into kind of how people and the administration dealt with COVID and how that really manifested itself in sport. CRISPR also I wanted to highlight in 2017 as well, basically allowing scientists to edit human genomes, which do have implications for sport. We're not going to get into too much detail of it today, but just understand that that might be a conversation that you have in your upper division or other classes that you might have in grad school about how genes and genomes can be edited to kind of create this new wave of extremely high performing athletes in this space. We're also going to very briefly touch on the media conglomerates, like I said in the Edson chapters, how media has kind of evolved and become more of a monopoly than we've seen in decades before. Then, of course, in 2020, we had COVID-19 and then the BLM protests and how they did also manifest itself in sport. But of course, you're more than welcome to read through this and for all the different things that happened during these last 11 years. But really now focusing more so on sports. Again, we're going to focus or touch on a lot of these things, but the things that I did want us to really see in terms of the stuff that's highlighted, talking about Aaron Hernandez and really kind of this culture of violence and allowing violence to happen on and off the field. In 2019, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed the very first NIL bill, so we will be talking about the NIL conversation as well as the transfer portal conversation and how that's affected sport. U.S. women's soccer wins their fourth World Cup in 2019. Kobe Bryant and Gianna Bryant were killed in a helicopter crash. If you saw that first image from the beginning of the slides, you'll see that that was a mural that was devoted to honor them, actually in Long Beach, which was really cool. If you've ever driven down Cherry, you're able to see it. In 2021, there was conversations about creating the European Super League, as well as the women's tennis kind of scandal that happened with Peng Shuai and her disappearance and that kind of conversation around women's treatment in sport. Djokovic was banned from competing in the U.S. due to his vaccine status. There was an MLB lockout that year, as well as the FIFA World Cup held in Qatar, sparking various conversations about human rights violations, quasi-slave labor that created the stadiums that this tournament was held in. In 2023, World Athletics bans trans women from competing in international sporting competitions. Biden signed the Equal Pay for Equal Play bill, or the Cantwell-Capito Act, basically enforcing that men and women who play for the national teams in the United States have to get paid and treated equally. In 2024, the women's collegiate and professional basketball popularity explodes. NIL gains a lot of traction. But even this past year, we had our most recent Winter Olympics. The IOC banned trans women from competing at the Olympics overall, which was a right that was originally left up to the nations themselves to decide how they wanted to go about really allowing trans people to play and represent their nation. Venezuela won the World Baseball Classic this past winter, spring, and UCLA, just to shout out, my alma mater, won its very first women's March Madness NCAA tournament. So all that to say, there's a lot that happens in these past 11 years. The Edson chapters, just to briefly go over, again, you learned about the globalization of sport. Sport, like most businesses, is extremely globalized in the sense that it's an exchange of global goods, money, and even culture across different nations in the world. Both American athletes play sports in other countries, and athletes from other countries play American sports, and so it's this exchange culturally that happens in the sporting space. You also read about Nike's crimes, which is really this very devastating account of the commercialization aspect of sports and how sports merchandising has kind of become this extremely lucrative business, aside from it being, used by professional athletes, but even for non-professional athletes, like recreational athletes, or even non-athletic people or physical people. People have Nike brand stuff. They describe the sweatshop-like conditions, child labor, poverty wages, even quasi-slave labor conditions, as well as worker abuse that Nike has done in their international factories. And so it's kind of a reflective question to you. There's a lot of reflective questions this week, but why are major companies allowed to get away with this? What would it take for you to stop supporting these major sporting brands? Will you continue to buy from Nike, Puma, or Adidas, knowing that they do things like this? And then finally, chapter 35 is really, again, talking about this globalization of sports through media and how the internet, via streaming, video games, social networking, gambling, fantasy sites, which we will be going over today, really contributed to this increased cultural globalization or soft colonization of sports culture. And so as I reflect on this and, thinking about the future and how things might evolve in the coming decades, do you think that sporting events will lack a physical audience in the future? We have a very integrated virtual reality or even artificial intelligence allowing us to experience a sporting event. So again, just things to reflect on for our Edson chapters, but now getting into stuff that specifically happens during these last 11 years. So we have various Olympics that happen, and I'm just going to kind of go over the highlights of the Olympics that happened since 2015. One of the major things with Rio in 2016, this was the very first time that a South American country has ever hosted the Olympics. And arguably, I would say it is going to be the last time that a South American country is going to host the Olympics. Rio 2016 proved to be a massive infrastructure failure for the nation. It was extremely expensive, and many of the stadiums and facilities that were created for the Rio 2016 Olympics were left to rot away. They didn't really serve a need for the community of Rio de Janeiro. And it's important to recognize that 95% of the money surrounding the Olympics doesn't go towards the athletes. It goes towards the construction of the city. And so when you consider that this is a multi-million-dollar project that, of course, they solicit money from other places, but that Brazil really had to front. Unfortunately, a lot of that money went to waste. And so that might be the last time the IOC approves a South American country from hosting, unless they can, again, show that there's financial stability in that choice. Pyeongchang in 2018, the Winter Olympics that happened in that year, there's a lot of conversation around the potential opportunity for political unrest, because this was the first time that we had North Korean and South Korean athletes, or one of the main times that we had North and South Korean athletes competing under the same banner. There are many examples of this happening before, but of course it brings into conversations of modern day with technological advancements, with opportunities for advanced warfare. But it proved to be extremely peaceful. Both countries fielded athletes under the same banner, but that is to say that there wasn't holistic peace. This was the first time one of the first times that we had the Russian Olympic Committee banned from competition. They had a state-sponsored doping program. This was kind of a precursor to the Russian-Ukraine war. And so a lot of people looked at this as a political statement, right? That Pyeongchang, the nation of South Korea, decided that they were not going to allow or the IOC, as well as the South Korean government, decided that they weren't going to allow the Russian athletes to compete under the banner of Russia, that they had to compete under Olympic athletes from Russia banner, kind of that, separation there. Putin found this to be particularly embarrassing as well, because of course they weren't really representing their nation in the ways that they wanted to. Tokyo 2021, obviously this was the first time that we had an Olympic Games delayed due to a national or international crisis. The only other times that games have been canceled were due to the world wars, as well as major boycotts, which you could argue kind of delayed or canceled the Olympics as it were. But Tokyo 2020 was delayed to Tokyo 2021. Obviously, COVID-19 was very much still in effect. A lot of sponsorship deals were actually under fire, which again, this is a multi-million-dollar project. It's important that you get the money to be able to host these games. But none of the sponsors pulled out, although there was a lot of potential legal ramifications if they did. Of new sports that happened during this Olympics were 3x3 basketball, which we have been very successful at as the United States. We have skateboarding, sport climbing, surfing, and karate. And if you look at our PowerPoint, if you have this PowerPoint on your device, you're able to click on that hyperlink for Rote, because a lot of sports writers who went to the Tokyo 21 Games wrote about how, truly peaceful it was. Yes, there wasn't the hustle and bustle because there weren't any in-person spectators. They didn't have families there, but they really felt this unique sense of camaraderie and satisfaction that the games actually happened, that these Olympians whose dreams kind of were formed with being able to compete at the Olympics still happened. Then the following year we had Beijing Winter Olympics in 2022, and Beijing became the very first city to host both a summer and winter Olympics. And so, like I said earlier, I believe that South America is no longer going to be given the opportunity to host major world events anymore. And I think that we are now going to see more double dipping cities like Beijing hosting both summer and winter Olympics. We're going to see a lot more repeats than we've had in previous generations of the Olympics. They want to have these Olympic Games at successful cities, or cities that they have been supported in success of hosting, in terms of not having any economic disparity between different nations. And so Beijing is the first of arguably, I think, many future double dippers or repeat cities hosting the Olympics. COVID-19 was still in effect during this Winter Olympics as well. They had very strict implementations of health and safety protocols. And for the second games in a row, obviously after Tokyo 21, it was closed to the general public. There were no in-person spectators besides a very few selected events at much reduced capacity, kind of maybe 1 or 2 people per athlete that was competing at these finals, these medaling events that were allowed. New sports. During this Beijing 22 Winter Olympics, we had big air freestyle skiing as well as women's monobob, and then other conversations around human rights violations. And so not a lot of folks remember this or were familiar of this, but at the time, Beijing hosting the games was really contentious. They were subject to various concerns and controversies over human rights violations in China, such as the Uyghur genocide, Chinese national Muslims in China, that they were being systemically kind of persecuted, and so there are a lot of conversations around whether or not China should be held liable internationally, if they should be kind of under more scrutiny for violating international human rights violations. And it even went as far as people wanting to boycott the games. And President Biden at the time actually sent a condemnation letter to China, basically saying, we don't agree with this genocide, we don't agree with what's happening, but we're not going to boycott our athletes. And so it's one of those things where it's like, by admonishing but not doing anything, is it really admonishing? Are you still kind of allowing this to happen because you're not really doing anything about it? So anyway, that happened in 2022. Couple summers ago, Paris 2024, some of the big things, obviously there was a lot of concerns about the pollution in the Seine for these various games that happened in their river. They had a lot of new sports like breaking and kayak cross. They reintroduced surfing, skateboarding, and sport climbing as well. And then on the U.S. front, Katie Ledecky became the very most decorated American female Olympian, at earning 14 medals total in her tenure. I'm really excited for her to come back to the United States in a couple of years and hopefully continue her legacy there. Then this past winter, we had the Milan Cortina Games for, winter 2026. Very much some of the highlights of that game. Again, if you saw it, it's really cool. The United States did really well in hockey, in ice skating, as well as skiing, other sports. But one of the things that they really kind of wanted to capitalize on was this Green Initiative. The Green Initiative was really heavily pushed at the Olympics for some time. Again, kind of acknowledging that Rio was an infrastructure failure in those ways. And so they really wanted these host nations to utilize facilities and stadiums that are already existing, right? They didn't want to create these new stadiums that would maybe be left to rot or not utilized, just a waste of resources. And so 85% of all games at the 26 Winter Olympics were already stadiums that were created. Some of the ones that were not created, which got a little contentious, were the hockey stadium. That was finished, I think maybe like 2 or 3 days before before competition was set to start. So that was really close to those deadlines that were established. The new sport that they introduced was ski mountaineering, and one of the political aspects of Milan Cortina was that the Paralympic Committee, the International Paralympic Committee, allowed Russian and Belarusian athletes to compete under their own banners. Again, kind of going back to Pyeongchang 2018, kind of going back against that precedent that was established then, in which Ukrainian athletes actually threatened to boycott going to the opening ceremony. They weren't not going to compete. But another way in which these games are heavily politicized. So just kind of wanted to share those tidbits with you there. And then continuing into our conversations of misconduct that happened. Also, shout out Long Beach, this guy with the hat here, which is so funny that just by coincidence, I was able to find that picture. But there are two, there are probably so many more scandals that we don't have time to talk about this lecture. But the two that I think are the most interesting are Operation Varsity Blues and the cheating Houston Astros. And so starting first with Operation Varsity Blues, this was a criminal conspiracy that was initiated by very high-profile celebrities and very rich individuals within the United States to influence undergraduate admissions decisions for their kids at a very plethora of top American universities. Essentially what happened is that over $25 million was given to this system by 33 parents between 2011 and 2018. 2019 is kind of when all this really kind of was broken wide open. But this money was used to bribe exam administrators, like if you take the SATs, the ACT, it was used to bribe the exam administrators to allow their student to have better scores. It was also used to bribe university officials and sports coaches from sports like tennis, sailing, soccer, basketball, water polo, even volleyball, among many others, for applicants to be perceived as elite athletes. Essentially, these students, that they had no idea that this was happening, by the way. The kids had no idea that this was happening. But these kids of these extremely rich individuals were pushed towards these universities as elite athletes, because as we know, student athletes have slightly different admissions requirements than non-student athletes. There's maybe a bit more of a conversation, a bit more back and forth, as opposed to a strict yes/no waitlist system. And so they took advantage of this system. Essentially what had happened is that they nominated these unqualified applicants to these elite institutions as elite athletes, and really facilitated their admission with this system. Essentially what had happened is, even if these students were not athletes, they hired professional athletes to demonstrate skills. You'd have to submit film to coaches, to schools, and they would hyperimpose their kid's face onto these professional athletes to show, have a paper trail of, hey, this person is an elite athlete, see what they can do in this sports skill. They fabricated these profiles, highlighting them as very elite athletes. They had good scores on their respective tests, and that was how these kids were able to go to these institutions like UCLA, like USC, like Stanford, Harvard. This was a national system, and so obviously people found out about it. Some of the people went to jail. I think Felicity Huffman, one of the most high-profile celebrities that was in this system, went to jail because of this bribery scandal. But overall, understand that Operation Varsity Blues was a college bribery scandal in which they took advantage of the different student athlete admission systems to allow their kids to be admitted to these top universities. The second one that I'm going to talk about is the cheating Houston Astros, in which the Houston Astros stole pitching signs that allowed them to win the 2017 World Series. And so what essentially had happened is that they had a camera in the outfield that would look towards it would look towards the dugout. The camera itself was looking at the batter, was looking at the catcher, so you're able to see the different, hand signaling that they would have in communication with one another. They would be able to see what that signal was. Pitcher was going to then pitch that respective pitch. They were looking at that, they would signal to the dugout by hitting a trash can to signal a certain pattern was a certain kind of pitch so that they would tip off their batters. Long story short, they were able to cheat the system by seeing what pitches were going to come, tip off their batter to prepare for that type of pitch, and then that batter was able to execute positively based on acknowledging that pitch was going to come. And so The MLB had extremely mild punishments for this system. The general manager and the manager suspended them. But only for a year for using electronic equipment to steal signs. They fined the organization $5 million. They stripped them of their first and second round draft picks from the 2020-2021 season. However, Jim Crane then announced that Lunthau and Hitch were both fired. So it really only took the initiative of the Houston Astros to fire these individuals who were kind of complicit in this system. No athletes were punished, no titles were revoked. And so this kind of showcases this idea of winner takes all mentality is extremely pervasive still at high level sports. Other forms of misconduct, things outside of the sporting specific space, was the Me Too movement. And so the Me Too movement existed outside of athletics initially. I mean, like there was a whole conversation around the social movement against sexual abuse, sexual harassment, where a lot of people publicized allegations of sex crimes committed by powerful and prominent people, celebrities, politicians, but also athletes. And so it really came to light in the athletic space with USA Gymnastics, namely with Larry Nassar. And so Larry Nassar was a former USA Gymnastics doctor. He was also the doctor of Michigan State University. He was called out during the Me Too movement for sexually assaulting gymnasts as young as 6 years old. They had treatments that would basically be some sort of pelvic penetration as a therapy for certain musculoskeletal disorders. And so this happened for over 150 women. Over 150 women came forward, and Nassar was effectively sentenced to life in prison. The president of Michigan State University, Lou Anne Simon, also resigned in the wake of the scandal. And without to get into too much detail, they knew that something was going on for over 10, 15, 20 years. And so it's kind of one of those conversations of like, how much did they really know? Athletes have been coming forward since the early 2000s about how they felt uncomfortable with Nassar, how they were doing certain things that they didn't, it felt off. And a lot of people dismissed them and really kind of allowed the prestige of the team doctor to trump any and all uncomfortability that these athletes experienced. And so because of this, there have been a lot more stringent requirements in coaching hires, in administrative roles, making sure that athletes have someone else that they can disclose these feelings with. That not only did USA Gymnastics basically completely changed their system, but so did USA Swimming. USA Fencing also had issues with sexual abuse in their coaches. And so this really allowed a larger conversation to happen about why sport in particular is a very seductive place for child predators to find victims. And it really kind of comes down to many different values. The idea that, a lot of athletes kind of don't feel like they have control of their body anyway, that it's for consumption, it's for entertainment, it's for, their performance and not necessarily for their own privacy and safety. Also ideas of, well, coaches and athletes don't get along anyway. Why should we question that? That's kind of expected that there might be conflict, but we don't really explore why that conflict will happen. And again, you have other instances of other athletes coming forward, like Breonna Stewart revealed that she'd been a victim of child sexual abuse when she was a kid. And all that to say, we've had more conversations of providing a space for equity, for protections. And so we see this manifest in many different ways. Obviously, we have stricter requirements for coaches to make sure that we're protecting our young athletes, but we also see this in terms of pay equity and also treatment equity. And so the U.S. women's soccer team I like to talk about a lot. I think they do a really good job of highlighting how far we've come in the past 11 years in terms of pay equity, in terms of how we kind of approach the conversations of gender and equality. And it really started in 2019 with this gender discrimination lawsuit. Essentially, after the World Cup that happened that year, they won gold. They sued the United States Soccer Federation for institutionalized gender discrimination. It was affecting their pay, travel, playing schedule, training, medical treatment, and more. And so in 2020, a judge actually dismissed dismiss the case, saying that they didn't have enough evidentiary support to say that the U.S. Soccer Federation discriminated against them based on gender. They appealed that decision, and in 2022, the U.S. Soccer Federation actually agreed to settle the lawsuit. They paid the women's national team $24 million. 22 of that $24 million went to the athletes kind of as reparations for things that they had experienced due to the system. $2 million of that $24 million went to athletes' various philanthropies, charities that they donate money to. And so that really set the precedent that just later that year, in May 2022, the U.S. teams agreed to a new collective bargaining agreement. Basically, this collective bargaining agreement would equalize compensation, bonuses, and other work conditions between the U.S. women's national team and the U.S. men's national team. Because they recognize that, yeah, within the United States, we can do a lot of work in making sure that men and women get paid equally, but that is not the same in other nations internationally. They acknowledge that men, even if they lose the tournament, will probably get more money than a winning women's team at various international contests. And so essentially what this new CBA does is it takes all of the prize money from one season for the women's team, all the prize money from one season of the men's team, combines it, and then splits it equally. And so that's how they kind of equitize this system. And so that was proven to be so successful that, like I said, the Cantwell-Capito bill was signed later that summer by President Biden that extended this privilege of equalizing treatment for men and women, not just in soccer, but for all U.S. national sports, water polo, fencing, bocce ball. And so this set the precedent for equality at all levels in the United States, which is really, really exciting. They also had to fight for equal treatment same year in 2019. One of the things that happened, if any of you watched that game, the opening game was the United States versus Thailand, and the United States beat Thailand 13-0, which any folks in the soccer world know that that is an astronomical score. And so during the game and even after the game, a lot of people were saying that they were being unsportsmanlike, they were running up the score, they weren't really doing mercy rules. But the United States pushed back, basically saying, would you have treated us the same if we were men who ran up the score? But also kind of more of a values conversation. Would you want a mercy rule at the largest and most competitive world stage for your sport? Would that be more disrespectful than to actually go all out the entire time? And so it was a catch-22. They really couldn't win. But unfortunately, that caused them to kind of have a target on their back the entire tournament. People wanted to defeat the United States. So much so that when they would celebrate their wins, when they would, be very demonstrative, very celebratory, that that year, so, before Biden became president, Trump was the president during the summer. President Trump actually said that they, were being too demonstrative, that they should actually win before they should, make comments about how they're, were one of the best teams, that they wouldn't go to the White House if they won. And so all that to say that this was an extremely politicized event. The U.S. women's national team really stood in their bravery and power to really allow this conversation of equality, political leverage to be a part of the conversation of that World Cup in that summer. That then inspired the WNBA to fight for equal pay as well. And actually just this past spring, they created a new CBA, which basically allows them to have 20% of the league revenue going towards the athletes. They have league minimums, league maximums that they're able to pay their athletes, as well as expansion teams because of this greater fandom surrounding women's basketball. And then finally, women coaches. Women coaches historically had not had a lot of opportunities in the leadership role. Title IX did provide a lot of opportunities for participation in sport, but not necessarily for leadership. But that statistic is changing. For the WNBA, we have a lot of women coaches. The NFL, we have well over, at this point, probably 10 women's assistant coaches since 2021. The MLB has well over 50 women coaches sprinkled throughout their tenure. And most notably, Kim Ng was the very first woman manager ever for the Miami Marlins. And she actually, with her tenureship, moved up to eventually be, I think, vice president of, human resources for the Miami Marlins. Don't quote me on that. But then now she is the commissioner of the newly created AUSL, the Athletes Unlimited Softball League. So professional softball that's happening. So very, very cool. And then the NHL actually created an NHL Coaches Association female coach development program, in which they were able to create 6 general managers, 10 pro scout coaches, as well as other things to allow for greater conversations and equity in the leadership space, which then spurred the 2021 NCAA basketball disparity. And so if any of you were on TikTok at the time, all this really led into this kind of fandom of women's basketball. But in March of that year, Oregon University basketball player Sedona Prince, who's in the news right now, but for other stuff, not of this conversation, but if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. But regardless, Sedona Prince went to TikTok to talk about the massive inequality between the men's and women's tournament at their weight rooms. And so, as you have various tournaments, they last a long time. They wanted to provide athletes a space to train while they were waiting for their games to happen. And so this was the men's, weight room. Had various squat racks, various, dumbbell racks. They had a lot of space, but this one singular dumbbell rack was the only thing in the women's weight room. And so that inspired other athletes to talk more about other ways in which there's inequality. This is the men's swag bag, basically this gift that men get for, being a part of the tournament. This is the women's swag bag. This is the men's food that they get. This is the women's food that they get. I don't even know what that is. And so that really spurred this greater conversation of why in 2021 do we still experience such disparity in gender, especially when this is a tournament that both men and women play at a very large scale. And so because of that, there was an independent investigation of the NCAA, and they were found guilty of, quote, prioritizing Division I men's basketball over everything else in ways that create, normalize, and perpetuate gender inequalities. The organization perpetuated a mistaken narrative that women's basketball is destined to be a money loser year after year. And so because of that, they were fined. They had to make changes. The women's tournament was finally granted the opportunity to use the bankable, kind of marketable name of March Madness, which before 2021, they had to just say that they were the women's basketball tournament. That doesn't really hold the same weight as March Madness that the men's tournament got to use. They also had to they were forced to broadcast the women's sports more. And because more of these games appeared on TV, that inevitably caused fandom, like the Caitlin Clark effect. And so the 2021 disparity really inspired the Caitlin Clark effect to happen. And it's not to say that there weren't other athletes that were extremely talented or extremely popular during this era, but Caitlin really kind of embodied this unique perspective of sports, acknowledging that this was a once-in-a-generation star. At the time, she played for the Iowa Hawkeyes. Now she plays for the Indiana Fever for the W. And she's completely reshaped this fandom of women's college basketball. They sold out tickets when they would compete nationally. They went viral every time that they would stop for autographs. She broke dozens of records, including the all-time scoring record for college basketball and the record for the most three-point shooter in a single season. That record, which was previously held by Steph Curry, arguably one of the greatest shooters of all time. And so people started to recognize that there are extremely talented athletes in women's sports that they really didn't see because they just didn't really know about it. And so for the first time in history, the viewership numbers for the Women's March Madness tournament that year crushed the men's. 18.7 million at peak compared to 14.8 million at its peak, respectively. It was the most watched college basketball game, men's or women's, college or pro, in 5 years leading up to that tournament. And so I call it the Caitlin Clark effect because sports writer Michaela McKenzie talked about this, the Caitlin Clark effect, an unprecedented respect and excitement surrounding women's college basketball. Could not have happened if generations of women across sports hadn't been fighting for every inch of progress that got us to this moment. And that's what makes it feel different. This season's of women's college basketball showed us what's possible, and it's up to us to keep the momentum. And so to acknowledge that, there's greater parity, there's greater conversations around equity and equality, and it's a really cool time to be a fan of sport that we're able to see these things happening live. One of the other interesting facets that happen in sport is this kind of very interesting cultural acceptance for violence. And there's a lot of issues surrounding the safety of the athletes, but doesn't necessarily seem to be enough for us to really care about the athletes themselves. And so, again, this is kind of a review of what we saw for Blood and Sport, but nonetheless important to talk about when you watch these videos, and how, again, even in 2026, why do we still have conversations surrounding athlete safety? Knowing that this sport is extremely dangerous, knowing that these athletes will probably die 20 to 30 years before their peers do. Why do we kind of allow this to happen? And if by watching these sports, are we complicit in that early death? Are we complicit in this treatment? And so when we reflect on these things, understand that there's this interesting kind of dichotomy of allowing this sense of violence to occur while also calling out systems that really infringe on mental health initiatives. Because now more than ever, this is an era that we are discussing, destigmatizing, and prioritizing mental health in sport more than we've ever seen before. I mean, we've had so many athletes from so many different walks of sports, of life. Michael Phelps, he obviously is one of the most prolific athletes, Olympians of all time. He talked about his depression and struggling with ADHD. Kevin Love, very famous basketball player. He played for UCLA, played for various teams, Miami Heat, but he was also on the Olympic team. He suffered his very first panic attack at 29 years old, and he's really open about his anxiety. He's a strong philanthropist for mental health. Mary Cain, she was an athlete as part of the now shut down Nike Oregon Project. Basically, Nike wanted to field their own professional athletic team, mostly for runners. And so she was encouraged to lose weight. She was encouraged to develop an eating disorder because they wanted her to be as light as possible. She had thoughts of suicide, obviously had a lot of depression surrounding the incident. We also have athletes like Brandon Marshall, Calvin Ridley, Everson Griffin talking about their mental health journey. Simone Biles with gymnastics, she experienced the twisties, anxiety, depression in the Tokyo 21 games. And so I like her quote just to kind of wrap up this conversation of mental health. I have to put my pride aside. I have to do what's right and focus on my mental health and not jeopardize my health and well-being. That's why I decided to take a step back. And she was flamed for that choice, but still stood strong in her decision to prioritize self and prioritize her own health. And that really kind of coincidentally leads into this conversation around the enhanced games. And so, yes, this is an era in which we are talking about health more than ever, but there's this interesting kind of countercurrent that's occurring right now at the enhanced level. So folks who are doing performance enhancing drugs to be the best athlete that they can possibly be. Culturally, historically, we have very much vilified athletes who used any and all advantage that they would have over competing against another athlete. This idea of fairness, this idea of, sportsmanlike behavior is very much consistent in most sporting cultures and throughout history. Right now is a really interesting time because, yes, obviously we've always had athletes who have done some sort of competitive advantage, whether taking anabolic steroids or doing cocaine or having blood doping for highly aerobic sports like cyclists, right? But right now we see this interesting kind of countercurrent of not pretending that it doesn't happen and not pretending that, we're trying to get away with it, be really sneaky about it. We see this interesting countercurrent of just letting it be out there. Yeah, I do steroids. Yeah, I do these performance enhancing drugs. And we see this very explicitly with the enhanced games. And so I highly, highly recommend checking out this website. You're also more than welcome to check out the enhanced/games because you're able to see their promotional video for the enhanced games. But essentially the enhanced games is an international sporting event where athletes will not be subjected to drug testing. And, they're not necessarily encouraging athletes to dope, but they're not going to discourage athletes from doping because essentially what they want to do is they want to have this sporting competition of athletes being the best version of themselves that they can be. That's kind of the rhetoric surrounding the enhanced games. And so I want us to be very reflective of this. Do you think that we should have an enhanced games? Would this diminish interest in non-enhanced leagues? Would there be any societal consequences to this kind of being an acceptable thing? And so one of the most interesting things I saw, this isn't on the website anymore, which I think for good reason. But nonetheless, I took a screenshot of this. I've got the receipts of when they had of this subsection of the website, 7 tips on how to come out as enhanced. And I think the diction of using come out is very intentional. The idea that of a community that comes out, it's usually the queer community, right? And in this space now, we have been more accepting of queer folks in and out of sport than we ever have, right? And so the idea of someone coming out, that it should be a celebratory event, maybe a supportive event, that diction being associated with that discriminated community, using it for folks who choose to be enhanced is very intentional. The idea that people in this community don't want to be discriminated against. And they use that language intentionally because it kind of puts people into that uncomfy strife of, well, if I, treat this group of individuals differently than a marginalized group, then what does that say about me in terms of bigotry, in terms of all this stuff? That being said, someone coming out in the queer community is very different than someone coming out as enhanced. And I think they do that, again, intentionally. But that's a choice for people to perform or do performance enhancing drugs. But nonetheless, I just wanted to show you kind of the 7 tips on what they recommend. And some of the rhetoric that they used, I think, is very synonymous with other kind of alternative cultures that's happening right now on social media, particularly number 3. I think the rhetoric of this one, don't worry about other people's actions. Just as lions aren't concerned with the opinions of sheep, so should you not concern yourself with those who cite outdated moral arguments and incorrect science. And so again, this is just one of the ways in which we use language, we use rhetoric to bring forth a very unique countercurrent to our historical reflection of sport. And I'm really interested to hear what y'all think about this conversation. And so this is basically what they have in terms of the plan for the athletes that choose to be a part of the Enhanced Games. Supposedly the Enhanced Games are going to be happening this May during Memorial Day weekend in Las Vegas. Again, check out the website. I think it's extremely interesting. One of your questions this week is going to be about what you think about the Enhanced Games, acknowledging that this kind of system already exists in other sports. But nonetheless, I want you to reflect on this very interesting part of our sports culture. Just as a review, obviously, for folks who have survived COVID-19, it was an extremely tumultuous space for our society, right? Period. But we also see this very deeply affected our sporting culture and our sporting experiences. COVID-19 caused nearly all sports to postpone or cancel their seasons that spring. And so I kind of just want us to note the different sports, how they kind of came back to playing at the professional level. Most college organizations, most youth organizations basically canceled their seasons indefinitely. They picked it up later at their own pace. But for professional sports, I did want to acknowledge how and when these organizations kind of came back. And so professional baseball was the very first organization to come back. They did not have a bubble, but they did have geographical restrictions. Basically, they wanted local teams to play locally. But because they didn't have a bubble system of limiting the amount of folks of contact, there were so many cases of COVID-19 contraction that summer and beyond. The WNBA was the first basketball organization to come back. They had a bubble system at IMG Academy in Florida, and they had absolutely no cases of COVID-19 contraction. They were extremely efficient in their bubble system. A week later, the NBA started back up again. They had a bubble system at the ESPN Worldwide Sports Complex in Disney World, and they, like the W, had absolutely no cases of COVID-19 for the athletes and the staff in that bubble system. The NHL was an interesting one. They came back just the day after, or 2 days after the NBA. But because there's a huge component of the NHL playing in Canada, there became a lot of international strife of how America kind of approached COVID-19 as being very different than how Canada approached COVID-19 in terms of restrictions, safety protocols. And so what Canada did was basically an ultimatum. They said, we're not going to send our Canadian teams to America, because they perceived America as not taking COVID-19 seriously enough. And so they said, you have to send your athletes up here. And that's what they did. So all 32 teams, or 31, I believe at the time, or maybe even 30. Anyway, all of the teams in the NHL went up to Canada. They had two city bubbles, so one in Toronto, one in Edmonton for the East and West conferences, and they played themselves until their season was over, and they had no cases of COVID-19 in their bubble systems. The the NFL was very unique in which it actually started when it was supposed to. They didn't have a preseason, which kind of allowed for a lot of injuries to happen later in the season. But they were able to kind of uniquely observe how the other leagues were doing and base their decisions off of what they did. And so they didn't have a bubble system. They decided it might be too logistically challenging to have bubble systems for football. They didn't have any delays for the regular season, but because of that, they had many, many cases of COVID-19, instances where an entire team would have a COVID-19 breakout. And so the bye weeks were extremely flexible, in which some teams kind of moved their bye weeks around depending on if they had a breakout or not. And so it was an extremely volatile season, but nonetheless still functioned relatively regularly. The following season, we had vaccines for COVID-19. And this is one of the most contentious things that happened as a result of 2019. Again, it was extremely politicized. And so how it manifests itself in the sports world was very interesting, because athletes in most professional organizations, all professional organizations, are represented by a union that kind of fights for their rights, their agency against these juggernauts of the NFL, of the NHL as kind of an organizational body. And so what these unions did is essentially guarantee that athletes could choose to get vaccinated or not. Currently, no professional sports organizations are requiring athletes to be vaccinated, even today. Although it gets sticky when local governments can. So depending on where you play, where you practice, and where you compete, they might have different designations based on that local jurisdiction. And so obviously vaccinated athletes had fewer restrictions than non-vaccinated athletes, which led to a lot of devious behavior. So I'm just going to kind of give you some examples of some of the things that we noticed, but nonetheless kind of highlight the idea of people always wanting to do what they believe is right, sure, but always try to get around the system that's set up to protect them. And so the first example, we have Kyrie Irving. At the time, the Brooklyn Nets point guard was unable to practice or play with the Nets because he was not vaccinated. New York City requires those entering indoor spaces at the time to have at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine, and he missed out on millions of dollars because he chose not to go to practice and games that season. Andrew Wiggins, Golden State Warriors forward, requested a religious exemption from the San Francisco, similarly to New York vaccine mandate, but the NBA denied the request. Wiggins then received the vaccine after his exemption was denied and then has been able to play with his team for the rest of the season. Aaron Rodgers, at the time, was a Green Bay Packer quarterback. He faced harsh criticisms after it was revealed that he was not vaccinated against COVID-19 after he had reported that he was immunized. And so people didn't really follow up on that, but he basically utilized other drugs to immunize himself without using the FDA-approved vaccine. Because of that, he basically had to go through hoops. He was fined. He didn't have to, because he lied about his immunization. He kind of went against the NFL's protocols for unvaccinated players, such as wearing a face cover, such as getting tested regularly. And so that unfortunately caused a lot of strife and kind of how people approached Aaron Rodgers after this. We also have Antonio Brown, who at the time, Tampa Bay Buccaneer wide receiver, he was suspended for 3 games for misrepresenting his vaccination status because he submit a fake COVID-19 vaccination card over the summer. Since then, he had become vaccinated, but we also see this in professional hockey too with Evander Kane, who at the time played for the San Jose Sharks. He was suspended for 21 games with no pay for submitting a fake vax card. And so in addition to COVID-19, in addition to the COVID vaccine mandates, that summer in 2020 was also the resurgence of BLM. And I did want to acknowledge that this is not the first time that BLM has really come to the space of sport. Obviously, in 2016, we have Colin Kaepernick. He began kneeling during the national anthem to protest racial discrimination, injustice, police brutality, and systemic racism. Some people supported him, others vilified him, like Trump, who said he ought to be fired, and since then has kind of been blacklisted from the NFL and other organizational initiatives. After 2020, or during that summer, most sporting organizations throughout the world began showing their support for BLM. Again, you're more than welcome to click on the CNN article that really shows, again, how wide that support was, from surfing to baseball, obviously, to the NFL, to tennis. Most sporting organizations kind of utilize this idea of, well, we can't do anything else besides being on our phone, being on social media. We're going to support this initiative institutionally. And so we found that this was a really interesting thing, because for a lot of folks, this was a contentious social commentary. This was a contentious kind of protest. The idea that not a lot of people believed that there were racist problems in the United States. There were no police brutalities that were happening. And so media companies historically really choose to be as apolitical as possible. The idea that they want to reach the widest net of customers, so they avoid kind of looking at or broadcasting controversial content. And so companies had a choice to make. They could lose money by showing sports who very demonstratively support BLM, as you see with the MLB behind every pitching mound, or they could not cover sports. And so this was the very first time that in my, reflections of history of sport, that media companies decided to showcase the athletes, decided to support this initiative by, broadcasting it, not necessarily supporting it by any, letter or any statement. But that to say, that was, a really big deal, because we got to see that most of these organizations supported it. And because of that, there was a lot of differing opinion about how different organizations were supported by their fans. The NFL did have some systemic support, but it was met with some backlash. And if any of you watched that, September 30th game in 2020, it was a really interesting game, because it was, again, kind of at the height of BLM 2020, the height of weird politicalization of COVID-19. And when they were singing, one of the initiatives that they did was, obviously they had stuff like "It Takes Us All" in the end zones. They had moment of unities for Black and white athletes and other athletes of color. But they also started to allow the Black National Anthem to be played before each game. And so when the Black National Anthem was playing that game, there were so many boos that were heard on the TV. So many fans. And I think it was in Texas. I think it was the Houston Texans and the Kansas City Chiefs. I could be wrong. But it was a really interesting kind of phenomena that happened, that you were able to see so much support, but also so much backlash for this initiative. And in the NFL, I think that that's very reflective of maybe a lot of the fan base across the nation who support American football. NBA, as well as the WNBA, had a lot of systemic support. They also boycott games in support of larger conversations around police brutality, especially that summer with the murder of Jacob Blake. He was murdered in Kenosha, Wisconsin, about 40 miles from Milwaukee. And so the Milwaukee Bucks boycott their game, in which other W and NBA and MLB games actually boycott their games that day too. For tennis athletes, we have Naomi Osaka, who, while she was playing for the US Open, wore a face mask with the names of different police brutality victims. Again, you're more than welcome to look at the CNN article to really show this. But one of the things, again, when you reflect on this being one of the first times that we've had organizational support for something that's relatively contentious, again, for a lot of people, we need to be really critical and reflective of if BLM in sport is very genuine. In 2026, do we see anything like we saw the systemic support in 2020? We really must approach this organizational support with a critical eye. Many athletes and leaders do believe in the BLM movement. We've had many examples of initiatives towards developing positive police community relationships. Inspire Change is one of the initiatives that the NFL has created as a result of this kind of greater conversation. Athletes are allowed to wear certain messages on their helmets to bring about, their political stances on certain things. But you also have to acknowledge that maybe some of these organizations capitalized on the trendiness of it. The idea that people were only doing this initiative work because they had nothing else to do during that summer. And so other examples of this kind of idea of performative action also eliminate this authenticity. In terms of Colin Kaepernick and Roger Goodell, NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell spoke out, "We, the National Football League, admit we were wrong for not listening to NFL players earlier and encourage all to speak out and peacefully protest. We, the National Football League, believe Black Lives Matter." And maybe it's a change of heart, but more likely they felt a social and financial pressure to support BLM. For the Washington Commanders, sponsors took extreme anti-racism stances. Basically, they would have statements saying that we don't support racism, we denounce police brutality against folks of color. And so what had happened is that a lot of these sponsors in professional football started to pull their support from the Washington team, the Washington R-word team, because obviously, as we reflected on this class, it's a racial slur and has been fought against for a long time. And so Nike, as well as many other multi-million-dollar organizations, started to pull their team's merchandise from its website. The team was losing money and consequently rebranded to the Washington Football Team and then now the Washington Commanders. That financial pressures, not genuine support for anti-racism in sport, caused the name change to happen. We also need to reflect on the leadership of folks in the NBA and the WNBA. That the NBA, for leagues that most of their athletes are Black, we do not see that statistic at the leadership level. And so when you say that Black Lives Matter, is it only for the exploitation and consumption of entertainment? Or do we allow athletes of marginalized groups to have opportunities for leadership, to really be true representations of the athletes that they coach? We do not really see that at the systemic level. Yes, in the NBA and the WNBA, but even beyond as well. And then finally, we have Josh Gruden. At the time, he was a coach for the Las Vegas Raiders. He was under investigation for saying a lot of homophobic and racist comments. And this was, again, kind of at the height of a lot of initiative change during BLM. And so all that to say, people really were engaging with BLM during that summer extremely passionately. They took to the streets. They were protesting on social media. And so new sports media has really allowed for a greater conversation of power and privilege in many different ways. And so people are engaging in sports in ways that we've never seen before. The internet is one of the most common mediums in which people are engaging in sports media. Yes, in terms of streaming, but also in terms of internet sites like social media, websites. And so as we reflect on this, do you prefer watching sports physically or do you like watching it through the internet? And so with that internet coupling really well with social media, it's caused a huge increase in fandom, connectivity, this kind of parasocial relationship that a lot of people feel like they have with their athletes that they follow. And so it's important for us to recognize that athletes kind of use social media in different ways. Some athletes actually are encouraged to restrict their social media engagement. They are encouraged to exercise caution because it could lead to embarrassing or even jeopardizing behaviors, as you can see here with these tweets that were exchanged between Logan Paul and Antonio Brown. And so a lot of these organizations actually discourage their athletes from using social media on off days leading up to or even right after a competition. It's also important to recognize that, too, a lot of athletes have autonomy over the stories that they want to tell, acknowledging that sometimes media is extremely biased, particularly against women and athletes of color. And so social media allows athletes to control what content is released and kind of negates the need for traditional sports media to skew it or kind of approach it in a way that's maybe not necessarily beneficial for the athletes themselves. We also have to acknowledge when we get to that in a moment that NIL very much capitalizes off of athletes' social media engagement. And which I also wanted to acknowledge too, the Players Tribune as another opportunity for athletes to tell their own stories. And so just right before this era, the Players Tribune was created by Derek Jeter, again, Hall of Fame baseball player. But I like this quote, "I'm not a robot, neither are the athletes who at times might seem unapproachable. We have emotions, we have stories to tell." And the Players Tribune is a really unique platform because it is a news site, it's sports media, that allows athletes to write their own kind of stories. It provides athletes with a platform to connect directly with their fans in their own words, and isn't necessarily short form content like we have with social media, but it can be long and short form stories, video series, podcasts. And as kind of a reflective question to you, do you think that avenues like the Players Tribune and social media are the best solution to combat bias in sports journalism? Another aspect of the advancements in sport and how that kind of bridges into maybe our complacency or maybe our participation in certain aspects is this idea of esport. And so sports video games have gained a lot of popularity. They contribute to sports spectatorship through various mediums. There's different types of esports. There's motion sensitive video games, which at the time, the Nintendo Wii was like revolutionary in 2008. But you also had the Xbox Kinect, the PlayStation Move. But now we have things like Oculus, virtual reality, the Nintendo Switch, that allow body motions to be interpreted through a computer interface and engage in that video games that way. But more often than not, esports take the form of traditional video games with the use of a controller, a handheld controller with an associated console, whether that's PC, Xbox, PlayStation. And there are a lot of tournaments of esports in which these athletes can make millions of dollars. And so it was that reached a $1.4 billion value in 2022. And this can come from the purse, which, just like we talked about with our horse racing, is the prize money. So the purse can be millions of dollars. I believe the Call of Duty pot a couple of years ago was over $3 million, or $6 million, excuse me. I just looked at my notes. You can also get endorsements. Various e-athletes have actually been endorsed by sporting brands. Ninja, arguably one of the most famous kind of old school streamers that kind of brought about this kind of culture to the main light. He was endorsed by Red Bull. Cloud9 was endorsed by Nike, as well as getting investments from traditional athletes. Athletes like Steph Curry, Michael Jordan have put in millions of dollars to developing their own esports leagues and teams. And so as we reflect on this, it's extremely popular. I mean, people play video games, and a lot of young people look at esport as a way to improve social mobility, just like people historically have looked at sports to improve upward social mobility. So as a question to reflect on, are there any benefits to esports? Do they develop the same characteristics as traditional sports? And then kind of what are some of the pitfalls of esports? We also kind of have a conversation around sports betting and fantasy sports. Again, sports betting is not new. The growth of sports betting is going to really now be on the internet interface with apps in states that sports betting is legalized, which California is not. So anytime you engage in sports betting in California, you are giving money to another state like New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts are some of the most popular. It's also important to know that there are different types of sports bettors in this era. Casual bettors do so more as like a social aspect. Maybe they put money in, but they don't really see it as anything super serious. It's more just as something to do with friends. While on the other side, active bettors are people who look at sports betting and gambling as an investment, kind of as a job. They're extremely versed in statistics. They're extremely versed in kind of the trends, in anticipatory needs of the sport. And demographics of folks who sports bet, typically they're men between the ages of 18 and 35. They have above average income, and they are spending that money, they have discretionary spending on stuff like this. Some of the most popular sports to bet on, we have the NFL, MLB, NBA, and it's important to know that with the NBA, we just had an NBA gambling scandal just this past season, in which athletes themselves were tipping off, sports bookies and other lines being made that they were going to do certain performances to encourage or discourage certain lines from being hit. And so this is still happening. People breaking the rules in order to make some more money with this lucrative system. We also see fantasy sports as a new kind of subsection of gambling, in which people choose athletes from various teams to create this fantasy team and elicit, hopefully, a really good performance. It's not necessarily to spend money on fantasy. Sometimes people just do it, again, more so for the friendship aspect, the social aspect. although most people do spend some money in fantasy sports. Just like with sports betting, the demographics of folks who engage more often in fantasy sports are men between the ages of 18 and 35, above average income, and do so because, again, of that social aspect. Just like with sports betting, NFL, MLB, and the NBA are the most common type of fantasy leagues engaged with. And so finally, to wrap up our conversation this week of talking about one of the most interesting developments these past 11 years is the social acceptance of NIL, so name, image, and likeness. And so name, image, and likeness, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, isn't new. People have been fighting for this for a long time, trying to allow athletes to make money off of the name, image, and likeness that universities have been utilizing and making money off of for generations before. And so just a couple years ago, the NCAA finally approved athletes to make money off of their name, image, and likeness in 2021. There were differences in how different states and conferences allowed NIL to really kind of flourish. Arguably, LSU is one of the most liberal in terms of how they allow their athletes to make money. But most organizations allow NIL deals to happen. Usually we find that Division I FBS schools, arguably like the most competitive, the most popular, have the most money and kind of support for this. But there are many ways in which these athletes can make money. They make money off of their own brand. They monetize their name, their image. They can sign corporate sponsorships, create your own logo, brand merchandise, cameos, autographs. And so just to kind of highlight too, that as soon as Caleb Williams transferred, and again, we're going to talk about the transfer portal and kind of synchrony with the NIL deals, he was able to make millions of dollars essentially overnight. That when he transferred from Oklahoma to USC, he got so many endorsement deals that he made more money than he might have on a rookie deal in the NFL. And so when we talk about the NIL, there's a lot of pros, right? Student athletes now rightfully hold an increased level of power over their own agency and brand. They have more financial help for their family and friends. It's used as a recruiting tool for high-profile universities. And football excluded, women make up majority of NIL deals. And so Livy Dunn, if any of you are on the TikTok space, you might have seen her. She's extremely popular. But she utilized her TikTok brand to have a lot of NIL deals as an LSU gymnast. And so because of that, she was becoming extremely popular. If any of you are in the professional baseball space, she's still dating Paul Skeens, who's, I think, one of the greatest young pitchers right now in baseball. But there's also a lot of cons to this extremely volatile system. It's really only benefiting athletes who go to the best or really high-profile universities to make those multi-million-dollar deals, and often at the expense of smaller market universities that don't really have the millions of dollars to be able to pay their athletes. The shift is much more focused on athletics versus academics, and even less on athletics and more so on marketing and commercialization. The idea that scholarship should be enough is kind of null and void. It doesn't really fix these fundamental issues that we've seen in college athletics. There's been a lot of mental health decline because of this commercialization and oversaturation of media. And even though women do get a large proportion, there are still a lot of gender differences in which well over half of all NIL deals go towards athletes in football, which are men. And there's little to no regulations or laws, which is interesting because I highly recommend, I forgot to put this in our slides, but just this past April, President Trump signed an executive order that it's something like executive order to save college sports, in which he actually proposes a lot of regulations. So I highly recommend checking it out. It's interesting in a lot of the ideas that he's proposing to really kind of rectify a lot of these issues. And again, if you're really interested in really how all of this NIL kind of volatility happened, and like I said, LSU is arguably one of the most accepting of NIL deals and kind of since its inception. So if you want to check it out, there's actually a documentary on Amazon Prime called The Money Game, LSU, in which they follow athletes like Livy, like Angel Reese, like Jaden Daniels when he was still playing for LSU, to really just kind of eliminate a lot of these interesting things that maybe student or non-student athletes don't really get to see that side of. But like I said, the NIL Wild West that we're experiencing wouldn't be what it is without the transfer portal rules changing in 2021. So the transfer portal was created in 2018 to really ease the burden on the college transfer process. Before then, it was kind of just like a lot of email exchanges, a lot of like behind the door deals. In 2021, in 2018, it allowed this platform to be entirely online. They actually had people that were hired to kind of regulate this system through every university that had an athletics department. But in 2021, something very unique happened, that it allowed all college athletes to transfer schools, including football and basketball, without athletes needing to transfer and sit out a season, which used to be the norm. If you were an athlete in basketball or football, if you wanted to transfer schools, you had to sit out an eligible year. And so that acted as a deterrent, right? They didn't want people just jumping ship, right? If something happened, if they weren't getting enough playing time, that has now been done away with. And so in order for athletes to enter the transfer portal, they have to notify their school of their intent to transfer. They're put into the portal. Coaches from all over the nation can kind of see who wants to be traded, what their value is. And so because of NIL, it's used in synchrony with the transfer portal, because basically these other universities can say, hey, if you come to our university, we'll give you money. And NIL deals, as it stands now, universities can actually just pay their athletes outright. And so that became a huge system that was extremely profitable. We also see that in addition to the transfer portal being extremely lucrative and extremely volatile, there are third-party websites that actually determine the value of the athletes in the transfer portal itself by ranking, by opportunity or potential to be extremely talented. They're usually assigned stars. They're usually assigned, ranking systems among other people in their position. And so this is an extremely streamlined system, right? It's extremely efficient at what it does. And just like NIL, it allows athletes to have more agency over their college experiences and potential NIL deals, but is an extremely volatile system. There's little to no regulation over it. One of the most impactful things right now is that, college basketball, that transfer portal is opened, and thousands of athletes enter the transfer portal, which maybe half of them will get picked up, maybe at the high optimistic end. But what happens to the athletes that don't get picked up? Do they go back to their teams? Do they just forego their sporting career altogether? There are a lot of ethical violations. There's a lot of athletes poaching. There's a lot of universities poaching athletes. NIL boosters don't really exist anymore, but it's kind of, again, really volatile, really lucrative, and it's extremely similar to free agency. And all that to say, we are commodifying people into statistics, into star systems, without really approaching athletes holistically. And so we are witnessing history as it exists now. I think it'll be really interesting this summer to see how that executive order is or isn't going to be applied to universities and how they approach the transfer portal. But nonetheless, is really a unique aspect to sport and how sport is going to evolve. And so we covered a lot this week. Every year I do this lecture and it gets longer and longer, so I apologize for the length, but a lot of really interesting happened these past 11 years. We talked about the Olympics. We talked about misconduct events and important details. We talked about the fight for gender equality, sporting crises, COVID-19 and vaccine mandates, the BLM movement, new media and global sports, sports betting and fantasy, and NIL and transfer portals. Let me know if you have any questions about the content for our final week. Please plan to do your lecture evaluations. Your honesty really helps me become a better instructor. I know the modality of online instruction is challenging. I wish that this class was in person, but nonetheless, I hope y'all had a wonderful time this semester. Some things to look forward to. Again, the quiz is due this week. Quiz 15, our final quiz. Then we have our paper 3 due as well. Those prompts are up. And then next week we have our final due on the 8th of May. It opens Monday at 12 a.m. You have the entire week to complete it, just like we have with our quizzes. Study guide is on Canvas. Again, it's about those review slides at the end of each lecture. It's important to know the firsts and the people of importance within each era. And then we have our PowerPoint presentation due on the 8th, as well as our extra credit postcard due on the 8th. So again, let me know if you have any questions about stuff this week or things coming up. I had a wonderful time teaching you all this semester, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all in in-person classes in the future. All right, folks, thanks again for a good semester, and I'll hopefully see you later. Bye.